Charity Hospital, New Orleans, 269 years of accumulated death, founded in 1736. This New Orleans hospital holds nearly 3 centuries of suffering within its abandoned walls after Hurricane Katrina. Tulane Avenue cuts through the heart of New Orleans like a surgical incision, and somewhere along its length sits the hollowed-out shell of what was once the second oldest continuously operating hospital in America. Charity Hospital opened its doors in 1736, and for 269 years, it performed a single function with relentless consistency. It received the sick, the injured, and the dying of New Orleans, regardless of their ability to pay, and it processed them through the machinery of institutional medicine until they either left alive or passed away within its walls. When Hurricane Katrina flooded the building in 2005, and the decision was made not to reopen it, what ended was not just a hospital's operation, but nearly 3 centuries of continuous accumulation. Every form of suffering that a major American city can produce, concentrated in a single location, layer upon layer, decade upon decade, until the building itself became something more than architecture. The history of Charity Hospital is the history of New Orleans told through its casualties. Yellow fever swept through the city in waves throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, and the victims arrived at Charity Hospital in their thousands, filling the wards until the staff could do nothing but make them comfortable and wait for them to perish. The Civil War brought trauma patients whose injuries reflected the specific brutality of that conflict. The industrial era brought workers mangled in accidents at the docks and the factories. The 20th century brought victims of street violence, of poverty-related illness, of every ordinary catastrophe that affects urban populations at the bottom of the economic structure. The hospital's morgue processed the dead of every major disaster in the city's modern history. Its psychiatric ward housed patients whose conditions and treatments reflected the full evolution of American psychiatric practice, from the therapeutic innovations of the late 20th century back through earlier decades, when treatment and punishment was sometimes difficult to distinguish from one another. The scale is what matters. Charity Hospital was not a small facility serving a limited population. It was a major urban hospital in continuous operation for 269 years, serving the poorest residents of a city with a substantial poor population. The number of people who passed away within its walls across those centuries cannot be precisely calculated, but it measures in the hundreds of thousands at minimum. The morgue alone processed remains on an industrial scale, particularly during disaster periods when the normal flow of institutional death accelerated into crisis. What accumulated in that building across nearly 3 centuries was not just the physical fact of death, but everything that accompanies death in an institutional setting. The fear, the pain, the confusion, the grief of families, the exhaustion of staff, the specific atmospheric quality that develops in spaces where human extremity becomes routine. When Hurricane Katrina flooded New Orleans in August 2005, Charity Hospital lost power and patients had to be evacuated in conditions that tested the limits of emergency medicine. The building sustained significant flood damage. In the aftermath, when the city began the long process of recovery and reconstruction, the decision was made not to reopen Charity Hospital. The reasons were complex, involving infrastructure damage, changing healthcare economics, and political considerations that go beyond the scope of paranormal investigation. What matters for the present account is the simple fact: the building was abandoned. After 269 years of continuous operation, Charity Hospital was left empty, its equipment still in place, its records still filed, its morgue and psychiatric ward and operating rooms and patient wards all sitting vacant in the heat and humidity of New Orleans, slowly deteriorating while debates about the building's future continued without resolution. The abandoned Charity Hospital became a destination for urban explorers almost immediately after access became possible. The building's scale, its historical significance, and the dramatic circumstances of its abandonment made it irresistible to people who document abandoned spaces. These explorers entered through various access points that opened as the building's security degraded, and they photographed and filmed the interior, producing an extensive archive of the building's condition across the years of abandonment. Mixed in with the urban exploration accounts were reports from paranormal researchers who came to Charity Hospital specifically to investigate the activity that witnesses were beginning to document. The consistency of these reports, produced by independent investigators who had no contact with one another and who explored the building at different times through different entry points, forms the primary body of evidence for what currently occupies Charity Hospital. The activity concentrates in two locations, the morgue and the psychiatric ward. The morgue's activity follows familiar patterns documented in similar locations worldwide. Witnesses report sudden temperature drops in specific areas despite the building's lack of climate control. Photographic and video equipment captures visual anomalies, shapes, shadows, distortions that appear in footage and images but were not visible to investigators at the time of recording. The atmospheric quality in the morgue is consistently described as oppressive, heavy, difficult to remain in for extended periods. This is the conventional paranormal signature of a space where enormous numbers of deceased persons were processed across centuries, not individual hauntings, but something more collective, an accumulation of presence that has saturated the physical location. The psychiatric ward presents something different. The activity there is more interactive, more responsive to the presence of investigators. Witnesses report hearing voices, not recorded voices or environmental sounds, but human speech that appears to originate from empty rooms and corridors. Some investigators describe seeing movement in peripheral vision, figures that vanish when looked at directly. The quality that most concerns experienced paranormal researchers is what they describe as influence, a psychological effect that goes beyond normal atmospheric discomfort. Multiple investigators report mood changes while in the psychiatric ward, emotional states that feel imposed rather than natural, patterns of thinking that become intrusive and difficult to shake, even after leaving the location. The explanation offered by researchers familiar with the site centers on the psychiatric ward's history. 20th century psychiatric practice evolved significantly across the decades of Charity Hospital's operation, but that evolution was uneven and included periods when patients were held under conditions that contemporary medical ethics would not permit. Some patients were committed involuntarily. Some treatments were experimental or ineffective or actively harmful. The distress experienced by patients in the psychiatric ward was not the clean distress of physical injury, but something more complicated, involving confusion, fear, isolation, and the specific suffering that comes from being held in a place against your will by people who claim to be helping you. If location can absorb and retain the emotional content of what happens within it, the fundamental premise of paranormal investigation as it applies to haunted locations, then the psychiatric ward of Charity Hospital absorbed nearly a century of psychiatric distress from patients who had no power to leave and limited ability to make their condition understood. Urban explorers who entered Charity Hospital without paranormal investigation as their primary purpose nevertheless reported experiences in the psychiatric ward that drove them to leave the building earlier than planned. The accounts describe a progression. Initial exploration proceeds normally, then gradually the explorer becomes aware of a quality in the atmosphere that was not present in other parts of the building. Then this quality intensifies into something that feels directed, personal, specifically aimed at the explorer, until the discomfort becomes significant enough to override the desire to continue documenting the location. Experienced urban explorers who have investigated dozens of abandoned hospitals and asylums describe the psychiatric ward at Charity Hospital as uniquely difficult to remain in, not because of structural danger, but because of the psychological pressure that builds during extended presence there. The morgue activity, while intense, does not carry this quality of directed influence. The morgue is simply saturated with death at institutional scale, heavy, cold, oppressive, but not interactive in the way that the psychiatric ward is interactive. The distinction matters because it suggests different types of presence. The morgue hosts what might be described as residual activity, an environmental recording of centuries of death that plays back under certain conditions but does not respond to or interact with investigators. The psychiatric ward hosts something more active, presences that appear to be aware of investigators and capable of affecting them in ways that go beyond atmospheric discomfort. Nothing has been done to clear or cleanse Charity Hospital. The building sits abandoned while its future remains contested. Some proposals call for restoring and reopening it. Others advocate for demolition and redevelopment of the site. The paranormal activity continues regardless of these debates, documented by the investigators who continue to access the building despite its deteriorating condition and uncertain legal status. The 269 years of dying that occurred within Charity Hospital's walls are not removable through any physical process. Whatever absorbed that accumulated suffering over nearly 3 centuries is now part of the location itself, independent of the building's structural fate. Charity Hospital stands as the largest paranormal archive in New Orleans, a city with no shortage of locations claiming supernatural significance. What distinguishes Charity Hospital is scale and authenticity. This is not a site with a colorful legend or a famous ghost story. It is a building where hundreds of thousands of people passed away across 269 years of continuous operation, where the city's most vulnerable population came when they had nowhere else to go, where suffering and death were processed on an industrial scale with institutional efficiency. The presences documented there are not theatrical or dramatic. They are the accumulated residue of centuries of human extremity, concentrated in the specific locations where that extremity occurred: the morgue where the dead were processed, the psychiatric ward where distressed patients were held under conditions that often made their distress worse. The building is also a monument to what New Orleans lost in Hurricane Katrina and chose not to recover. Charity Hospital served the city's poor for 269 years, and when it closed, that service ended. The empty building on Tulane Avenue is not just a haunted location. It is physical evidence of a decision to abandon something that had operated continuously since 1736, to leave it sitting empty while debates about profit and development continue year after year. The presences in the abandoned hospital are the dead, but they are also the record of what the city chose to walk away from nearly 3 centuries of commitment to serving the most vulnerable, ended by a storm and never restored. If you found this case compelling, subscribe to Vanishing Roads for more documented paranormal investigations from around the world. This story was created with AI assistance based on documented case files. All events reference real investigations and reported incidents.